In this video, we're going to talk about the innervation of the lower limb. This is going to involve a discussion of the dermatomes and the myotomes. Just as a reminder, dermatomes are areas of skin that are innervated by a single spinal nerve. Now remember that each spinal nerve splits into a ventral and dorsal ramus. The dorsal rami innervate areas of skin located on the posterior aspect of the trunk and the head. This makes sense because this is the dorsal aspect of the trunk and head. The ventral rami, however, innervate the rest of the body, so areas of skin on the anterolateral trunk as well as the limbs. You can see how regular their pattern is on the trunk, creating stripes across the body. You can even see how those stripes extend into the upper limb in a very logical way. However, when you look at the lower limbs, it looks like those dermatomes are not logically arranged at all. But in fact, they are logically arranged, but they got twisted when the lower limb rotated during embryological development. So the ventral rami that innervate the lower limbs are from spinal nerves L2 to S2. And they started off in a very logical pattern as that limb bud was initially forming. So they followed the preaxial border and the postaxial border along the limb. So we can see L2 here, then L3, L4, L5, S1, and then S2. Remembering that the preaxial border is on the thumb or the big toe side of the limb. As the limb continued to grow, these dermatomes simply got stretched out, and you can see that they're still following that same sequence along the pre and then the postaxial borders. Then the lower limb had to rotate, and this is when the dermatomes started to become twisted. But they are still following that arrangement. So we can see here is the big toe side, so this must be the preaxial border. And yes, we've got an L2, then an L3, then an L4, L5, S1, and S2 is probably now hidden on the posterior surface because of that twist. In the adult limb, the pre and postaxial borders are marked by the great saphenous vein and by the short saphenous vein, with the great saphenous vein following the preaxial border from the big toe side and the short saphenous vein following the postaxial border from the little toe side and sitting in a posterior position. So as long as we know where the great and the short saphenous veins are, we should be able to recognise the logical sequencing of the dermatomes starting at L2. So, running down the preaxial border, we find L2, then L3, then L4, then L5, and L5 is covering that big toe region, then S1 onto the little toe side, S1 continuing posteriorly onto the plantar surface of the foot, and then S2 is the last patch on the posterior aspect of the leg and the thigh. So we can see that the dermatomes have maintained that same logical sequence. Remember that this dermatome is telling us that the GSAs that are carrying sensation from this patch of skin will be travelling via the S2 ventral ramus to the S2 spinal level. Myotomes are the same concept but for skeletal muscle. So each spinal nerve was also allocated to innervate a particular group or block of muscles, and that's called the myotome. Each myotome split into epimere and hypomere, with the epimere forming the muscle of the true back and innervated by the dorsal ramus of that spinal nerve, whilst the hypomere formed the muscle of the anterolateral trunk and the limbs, and were innervated by the ventral ramus of that particular spinal nerve. So to summarise in relation to muscles of the lower limb, the muscles of the lower limb are derived from hypomere and are innervated by the ventral rami of the L2 to S2 spinal nerves, the same spinal nerves as for the dermatomes. This diagram shows us the sequential arrangement of the myotomes. The general sequence is different to the sequence of dermatomes that follow the pre- and post-axial borders. Instead, the myotomes simply work their way from more proximal muscle groups down to more distal muscle groups. So we should expect that higher spinal levels, such as L2 or L3, will innervate mainly muscle groups around the hip, whilst the lowest spinal levels should be innervating lower muscle groups. This here is the diagram that we use to demonstrate the myotomes. It tells us the muscle group by showing us the particular action of that muscle group. For example, the diagram up here is telling us that the hip flexors, so hip flexion, hip adductors and the hip internal rotators are all innervated by the L2 and L3 spinal levels, whilst the hip extensors, abductors and external rotators are innervated by L4 and 5 spinal levels. Here at the knee, it's telling us that the knee extensors are innervated by L3 and 4, whilst the knee flexors innervated by L5 and S1. And finally, at the ankle, it's telling us that the ankle dorsiflexors are innervated by L4 and 5, and the ankle plantarflexors are innervated by the S1 and 2 spinal levels. So we can see that there is often overlap here, where one spinal level will actually contribute to innervating more than one muscle group, or a joint but in more than one direction. We can also see that the pattern isn't perfect. It isn't an exact sequence from proximal to distal, but we can use this as a general rule. Now, one final point I'd like to raise is that the pattern of dermatome and myotomes has some anatomical variation. However, what we've given you is the most commonly accepted pattern for both the dermatomes and the myotomes. So let's now put this information about dermatomes and myotomes into context. Let's imagine a scenario involving a spinal nerve compression. So perhaps someone's had a prolapsed intervertebral disc in the lumbar or the sacral region. And this prolapsed disc is compressing a spinal nerve. And that compressed spinal nerve is going to affect all the afferents and efferents that are travelling through it. And therefore it's going to cause sensory symptoms such as numbness in the associated dermatome, and or motor signs such as weakness in the associated myotome, or a loss of reflexes in that associated myotome. So patient A has numbness of the skin over the posterior thigh and weakness of the ankle plantar flexors. Based on your understanding of the dermatomes and myotomes of the lower limb, I'd like you to try and figure out which spinal level must be affected. Patient B has pins and needles of the skin over their anteromedial shin and a diminished knee-jerk reflex. Again, I'd like you to consider the dermatomes and myotomes of the lower limb and try to figure out which spinal level you believe is affected. You can post your ideas on the discussion forum to get some feedback.